at the University of Texas and one of the organizers of the series, along with Christopher Smith, Paul Deutschman, and Saeed Razani Najad. Before we start, we'd like to thank the Executive Council of HBES for their support and Communications Officer Nicole Barbaro for her help marketing the series. Because this is an HBES-sponsored meeting, please note that this meeting is subject to the HBES Code of Conduct, which I will share in the chat. In general, we just ask that people be respectful and professional to one another during the event, and anyone who violates the Code of Conduct will be removed from the session. We also encourage audience participation throughout the event. So if you have a question, please feel free to use the Ask a Question button on the bottom right hand of the screen. Please try to keep your questions as brief as possible, maybe a sentence or two, and feel free to upvote questions asked by other audience members that you'd like to see answered. And finally, everything is being recorded and will be posted publicly to the YouTube channel after the event. So today we will focus on the evolution of mental health disorders, and moderating our event today is Dr. Ed Hagen. Ed is a professor of evolutionary anthropology at Washington State University, Vancouver, and his research focuses on evolutionary approaches to substance use and mental health, child growth, and development. And with that, I'll pass it over to Ed. Thanks.
Thanks everybody for joining us. First, I'm going to ask each of our panelists to introduce themselves, after which we'll have 2 rounds of questions for each of the panelists. That should all take around 30 minutes. And then the second half of the 30 minutes, feel free to post questions in the question box and we'll respond to the audience. So Bernie, if you could introduce yourself.
Right, I'm an evolutionary biologist at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada. I work on social evolution and the evolution of disorders related to social evolution, especially autism and schizophrenia.
Thank you. Next, Kristen Syme, if you could introduce yourself.
My name is Kristen Syme. I'm a postdoc in the Department of Experimental and Applied Psychology at Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam. And my research is on, I study suicide as well as cooperation.
Next, Matt Keller, if you could introduce yourself.
I'm Matt Keller. I'm a professor in psychology, behavioral statistical psychiatric genetics at CU. That's the new term. It's basically behavioral genetics. And also the interim director at the Institute for Behavioral Genetics. And my research is mostly on understanding the genetic architecture of complex traits and the development of methods using whole genome data.
Thanks. Finally, Simon Baron Cohen, if you could introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Simon Baron Cohen, speaking to you all the way from Cambridge, England. And I'm the director of the Autism Research Centre here at Cambridge University. And we do studies ranging from the molecular right through to the behavioural and clinical to try and understand both the causes of autism and also evaluate interventions for what might be helpful.
Thank you all. So the major themes I'd like to touch on throughout the roundtable are first, biological psychiatry promised big advances in understanding and treatment of psychiatric disorders, but in 40 years since DSM-3, there seems to have been little progress in either explaining or treating them. The second theme is we learned from the recent flood of genetic data, looking to map that filled in there. And 3, of course, this is HBES, so what can evolutionary theory do to perhaps lead us to better explanations and treatments for psychiatric disorders? Now, my first question is going to be to Kristen. The DSM-3, which introduced standard diagnostic criteria for mental disorders that are the basis for almost all mental health research today, was published about 40 years ago. A few years later, Prozac was introduced and hailed as a miracle drug for the treatment of depression. These developments seem to promise that we would make rapid progress in understanding and treating mental disorders, perhaps the biggest outstanding mystery in medicine. What is the evidence that psychiatry has made good or failed to make good on those promises?
Thanks for that question, Ed. So the DSM-3, which laid the foundation for modern diagnosis, was in part born out of a crisis in confidence in psychiatry in the 60s and 70s. First, on the grounds of social critiques that psychiatry is an institution that controls deviant behavior rather than treats true pathologies. And that is undeniably true in some cases. We know homosexuality was in the DSM until 1973. And the modern version of that is gender dysphoria, which was reclassified from gender identity disorder in 2013 in order to maintain insurance coverage for a population at risk for depression and suicide. Of course, we know that the same population is also at risk of social exclusion and bullying and victimization, well-known risk factors for depression and suicide. So we know that the classification is deeply embedded in social systems specific to certain times and places. That was true back in the 70s, and it's still true today. Second, psychiatry was criticized on the basis of diagnostic reliability, particularly when third parties, such as governments and private insurance companies, began paying for treatment. At the time, diagnosis was based on the psychodynamic approach, and patients could be in treatment for years without signs of improvement. Leaders of the DSM-3 effort, including psychiatrist Robert Spitzer, promoted the symptom-based approach to diagnosis, the approach that is still used today, to increase diagnostic reliability. However, it's been raised that increasing diagnostic reliability has come at the expense of diagnostic validity. Critically, when the criteria for diagnosis were developed, they were based on comparing mentally ill patients to other mentally ill patients to distinguish conditions from each other, not to distinguish the mentally ill from the general population. When the criteria were first applied to the general population, they found astonishingly high rates. About a quarter of the population met criteria for a diagnosis in the past 12 months, and half the population in their lifetime. Those are the same numbers that we see today. So nothing has really changed. The bulk of which of those disorders are common mental disorders, including depression, anxiety, and PTSD. The treatments that are available are largely aimed at treating symptoms rather than underlying causes, and they do show modest efficacy. However, despite what's been touted, depression is not caused, for instance, by a neurotransmitter imbalance. Neurotransmitter depletion, for example, doesn't make non-depressed people depressed. And so there are a lot of ethical concerns with how the science has been communicated to the public. Also, antipsychotics used to treat schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, also aimed at treating symptoms as opposed to an underlying cause, are notoriously unpleasant, both cognitively. They also are associated with metabolic issues. And not surprisingly, there is a high patient non-adherence rate. And moreover, people diagnosed with schizophrenia are still experience joblessness, homelessness, and they have a much lower life expectancy compared to the general population. Ed and I have argued, Ed Hagen and I have argued that this lack of progress is in no small part rooted in the very foundation of psychiatric classification, the DSM itself. And that's not just our opinion, that's the opinion of some of the most senior scholars in the field, directors of the National Institute of Mental Health, including Tom Insel and Steve Hyman. Robert Spitzer himself, who led the DSM-3 effort, said back in 2005 that the symptom-based approach was meant to be temporary. And he even lamented how little progress has been made towards understanding causation, and that if anything, the situation was much more complicated than they'd imagined. And we're really at the same place that we were to a large extent in 2005. And of course, as we know, and as Matt's work shows, the science on mental illness has gone down paths, very expensive paths that have not really borne out what they have claimed that they would. In some, the stakes are high, and yet it's not clear that science is really on the right trajectory.
Thank you. Okay, Matt, that's a good segue to you. Here's my question for you. A major justification for the Human Genome Project was that it would lead to better understandings and treatments of diseases, including mental disorders. Disorders like autism and schizophrenia are highly heritable, suggesting that they are caused by genetic variants. But exciting discoveries based on candidate genes, such as the interaction between stress and serotonin transporter alleles and the etiology of depression, have failed to replicate. What have we learned about psychiatric disorders from the flood whole genome sequence data, such as the role of rare variants and structural variants? Does genetic evidence better support the categorical DSM disorders, or rather dimensional views of mental disorders?
All right, well, it's a big question, and I don't know if I can do it all in 5 minutes or whatever the allotment is. But just so I guess I'll start with a few things. So first, I just wanted to agree with most of what Kristen said. I do disagree with one statement you made, Kristen, which is that we're about at the same place as we were in 2005. I think we've actually made tremendous progress over the last 15, 20 years. And so I kind of go through that briefly, what I think some of those are. So one of them is that we have, I think, pretty definitively have disproven, that's a strong word, but I think we're getting close to that with most of the candidate gene hypotheses that were bandied about and continue to be bandied about. These have mostly been jettisoned within mainstream genetics. And the reviews that we've done in my lab and other people have done just really show that these, I think it's a kind of a cautionary tale in science about how we could have misled ourselves for 15 years, and there can be thousands of publications on things that were really, I think, studying basically noise. So that itself is progress. I think it's interesting. I think it's more interesting sociologically than scientific, or than scientifically, but it is progress. But at the same time, right, since about 2010 and up till now, we are making real progress with now thousands of specific polymorphisms that have been associated with disorders, reliably so. I mean, these are real associations that we see pop up again and again if you have high enough power. And those are starting to make some kind of biological sense, although often not exactly how we had anticipated beforehand. So a lot of our prior biological hypotheses have turned out not to actually bear much fruit, but they are pointing us in new directions that I think can make sense. For example, glutamatergic synapse genes and calcium-gated genes all seem to be associated with schizophrenia. Those aren't genes that we had thought would be relevant going in, but now they do appear to be so. So I think that's some other progress that we've made. The other thing I would say, Ed, you had brought up that there's now large-scale sequencing. Sequencing is really where we're capturing all the genetic variants across the genome, and for the most part, we've really been using array-based data up to this point for these large studies, and so that's different. That really means that we're blind to the effects of the rare variation, and mostly what we've been capturing so far is just common variation, and that's very relevant to evolutionary hypotheses of psychiatric disorders. I think one thing that has been surprising, at least to me, is just how much of the genetic variation is accounted for by common variants across the genome. Something like a third to a half of the heritability of traits is accounted for by common variants, which at first glance seems to be inconsistent with mutation selection balance. If I have time later, I'll explain why I don't think that's necessarily the case. So where else did I want to go with that? Let me say one other thing that I think is so remarkably consistent across studies that I think you could almost call this a law of complex trait genetics at this point, and that is that regardless of the frequency of the variant that we're looking at, so we do have some insight to rare variants when it comes to deletions and duplications and copy number variants. Other than that, we're pretty blind or underpowered at this point. But regardless of the frequency, all the low-hanging fruit, all the biggest effects, seem to have a capped effect size of the maximum amount of variance explained by schizophrenia affecting loci, for example, is about 1/20th of 1%. These are the biggest effect variants that we can see, and that's true of rare variants, like copy number variants, and common ones. So I guess the huge things that we've learned is that there are a tremendous number of loci out there that can influence psychiatric disorder risk. And the biggest effects are tiny, and most of the rest of them must be smaller still. So then just the last point, Ed, I don't know how I'm doing on time, but how am I doing on time, Ed, by the way? Okay, all right. So the last point I wanted to make was this question about nosology, about how genetics is helping psychiatric nosology. And I think that the answer there is it's been slow progress, right? I think that the hope is, as Kristen said, that we're going to be able to use genetics to help us move away from symptom-based nosology to etiological-based nosology. And I think that everyone in the field, this is the holy grail, right, to figure this part of it out. And to uncover, complex trait heterogeneity using genetics. Everyone in the field knows this is important, and I think almost to a person agrees that we will make headway on this, and that we have made some headway. but it's just been remarkably slow, in part because the unanticipated smallness of the effects of the variants that we're seeing mean that we need larger and larger and larger sample sizes approaching hundreds of thousands or millions of cases before we're going to uncover the majority of the genetic variants underlying the heritability of psychiatric disorders. So I think I'll stop there, but yeah, thanks for the question.
Thanks, Matt. Next one to Simon. Evolutionary theory has not had an influence on mental health research. A major exception is research on autism, which has been heavily inspired by your application of research on the theory of mind in chimpanzees versus humans to understanding cognitive deficits in autism. Over the years, mind blindness hypothesis has morphed into the empathizing and systematizing theory of differences in cognition and the extreme brain theory of autism. Briefly describe autism for our audience, and then sketch your theories and the evidence that supports.
Okay, thanks, Ed. Let me start by sketching autism, because that was the last part of your question. What we've learned is that you need to separate autism from co-occurring conditions, because in the old days, we used to see autistic kids, autistic adults, many of whom had learning disabilities, and we thought that was all part of the autism. Well, what we've learned is that you can separate the two. So you can have autism alone, which, as most people will know here, is diagnosed on the basis of difficulties with social relationships and communication, and difficulties in dealing with unexpected change. But most autistic people also have co-occurring conditions, or many do. So that could be learning disabilities, it could be language delay, could be epilepsy, could be medical health conditions like gastrointestinal pain, could be mental health conditions like anxiety and depression. But what we need in science is to separate the autism itself from the co-occurring conditions. Second big thing that we've learned, I think, is that in the old days, we thought that autism was categorical. You either have it or you don't have it. And that is still the approach used when we're doing genetics, for example, case control studies. But what we've also learned is that there are autistic traits that run right through the population. So that's a bell curve. And so that when we're trying to understand the causes of autism, we also need to understand, what gives rise to variability in autistic traits. Maybe the third thing we've learned is that autism is strongly genetic. So this is really picking up on what Matt was describing, that there's been incredible progress in understanding how to study both rare genetic variants, but also common genetic variants. Rare genetic variants have been found in association with autism, but really they only pop up in about 5 or 10% of autistic people. They have a big effect, but they're only seen in a small minority of autistic people. And yet we know that heritability of autism may be as high as 60 to 90%. So it's one of the most genetic or heritable conditions in psychiatry. But the differences are likely to lie in common genetic variants for which you need really big data. Matt was saying, tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of cases. And the biggest genome-wide association study in autism has had 28,000 autistic cases and only revealed 5 common genetic variants that were significantly associated with autism. So we're going to need even bigger data than that to reveal them, because each of these SNPs or single nucleotide polymorphisms only has a tiny effect. So they don't show up unless you have big data. But Ed, the other side to your question was about mind blindness. So this is now a very old theory that I developed back in the mid-80s. Let's fast forward to 2022, where we still see evidence for mind blindness, which is the difficulty in understanding other people's perspectives, other people's thoughts and feelings. So these days we also refer to that as cognitive empathy, and that's distinguished from another type of empathy, which is affective empathy. Autistic people seem to struggle with cognitive empathy, so imagining other people's thoughts and feelings. They don't seem to struggle with affective empathy. So that is having an appropriate emotional response when they hear how someone is feeling. So if you tell an autistic person that somebody is upset or distressed, autistic people, just like anybody else, will want to do something about it to alleviate that person's distress. So autistic people are not like psychopaths or people with antisocial personality disorder, but they do struggle with cognitive empathy, being able to imagine another person's state of mind. Maybe we'll come back to this in the sort of second round of questions, but what we're revealing is that when you study empathy and another cognitive process, systemizing, which is the ability to understand patterns and understand how systems work, we see diversity in the population. People vary in terms of their level of empathy and their level of understanding systems. Autistic people seem to have elevated scores in terms of systemizing or pattern recognition. So despite their disability, they're showing talents. And one of our recent studies, again with big data, working with the company 23andMe, was able to show that common genetic variants associated with your scores on systemizing or pattern recognition strongly overlap or are highly correlated with the common genetic variants associated with autism. So whereas in the old days, there was a kind of medical model of autism suggesting we should be looking for, if you like, diseased mutations, nowadays we're recognizing that autism involves differences. Some of those differences are strengths or even talents, particularly in the area of pattern recognition or understanding systems. And in my recent book, The Pattern Seekers, I argue that the genes associated with autism have driven human progress. They've been, the genes associated with pattern recognition, uniquely in humans, which give rise to the ability to invent, have played a significant role in human progress or human evolution. Maybe we'll come back to that.
Thanks. Final question this round to Bernie. In 2008, you and Christopher Badcock proposed that psychosis and autism are a diametrical disorder of the social brain, perhaps caused by imprinted genes. Like Simon, your views seem to have developed a bit over the years. First, briefly describe psychosis and its relationship to schizophrenia, and then explain why you see autism and psychosis as diametrical disorders of the social.
Right. Psychosis is just reality distortion. It commonly includes delusions or hallucinations, often with social content, so something like paranoia or megalomania. So the delusions, hallucinations have to do with other people, voices, and what other people are doing or thinking in relation to you. Psychosis is very I don't want to say common in humans, but it's a state that humans fall into relatively easily. So it's been associated with over 100 different particular conditions. Schizophrenia is the main one. So if one wants to study psychosis, one tends to end up focusing on schizophrenia because this is where it's been looked at most. It's what's called the main positive symptom of schizophrenia. And we have developed a theory which is essentially based on a set of social traits evolving in humans, and those traits can be either dialed down, giving you the manifestations of autism, or dialed up, giving you the manifestations of psychosis. And the the theory is tightly linked to evolutionary biology in that the disorders themselves are connected as closely as possible with the adaptations that have given rise to modern humans. So when one looks at symptoms in these psychiatric disorders, these can be seen as maladaptations of aspects of the social and non-social brain, and then one needs to look at, well, what adaptations have essentially gone wrong to give you those maladaptations. So Syme's ideas related to systemizing and empathizing are a perfect example of this. Pattern recognition is highly adaptive in humans, closely related to intelligence. If you have too much of it, then it can become maladaptive. Similarly with empathizing, empathizing is obviously good for connecting with people and sharing emotions, but if you have too much of it, then this is associated with psychiatric disorders. So, for example, there's a genetic association between high empathizing and risk of schizophrenia. So we've also linked these ideas with genomic imprinting. I want to stress that imprinting is only seen as one contributing factor related to these disorders, and it appears to mainly have effects in terms of the large-scale alterations, such as you see in Prader-Willi-Angelman syndrome or in Williams syndrome, deletions or duplications of that region, or in Beckwith-Wiedemann syndrome. And in all of those cases, the theory is supported in terms of the effects of imprinting. And indeed, the strongest genetic risk factor for psychosis, in this case affective or mood-related psychosis, is Prader-Willi syndrome that's due to maternal uniparental disomy, having two maternal chromosomes for chromosome 15, where these imprinted genes are. It's a little unclear as regards the effects of small effect imprinted genes. It hasn't really been studied well enough yet with large samples. That's all for now.
All right, let's head into round two. We'll head back to Kristen here. Kristen, the bulk of global disease burden attributed to mental disorders is not from autism or schizophrenia, but depression. So why the big difference? How does the epidemiology of depression differ from autism and schizophrenia? You have argued that depression might be an aversive but adaptive response to adversity. Yet because of the increased risk suicide, depression can be lethal. Explain your evolutionary theory of suicide as an adaptive, credible signal of need and the evidence for this view.
Yeah. So yes, depression is both common and can onset at any period, starting in adolescence. Women have a higher prevalence of depression than men. Over 25% of women, I'm talking about major depression. So the criteria I just criticized a few minutes ago, I'm using those criteria. So there is sort of an arbitrary cutoff there. Over 25% of women have depression in their lifetime compared to about 14% of men. In contrast to popular narratives, depression does not usually arise out of the blue. It is closely associated with conflict and adversity, not just in the US, but also in low, middle income countries as well. Carol Worthman, for instance, has work in Nepal that low socioeconomic status and stressful life events and low caste are associated with depression. Also, Matt Severman and Sarah Matthews' work on Turkana warriors found that depressive symptoms and PTSD were associated with committing moral violations in war, which are indicative of a type of social conflict. Cross-nationally, sexual assault and violence exposure is a major risk factor for suicidal behavior and depression in women. And postpartum depression, a lack of social support for the mother, especially from the father of the child, is a key risk factor. Biomedicine classifies major depression as a disease, but in fact, it has many of the hallmarks of being an aversive but adaptive response, like pain, anger, jealousy, and many other clearly fitness-relevant states and emotions. First, as I mentioned, it's common in the population, especially among women. Second, depression has modest heritability compared to schizophrenia and autism. autism, which are much more heritable and much more rare, suggesting a stronger genetic etiological basis compared to depression. Third, depression is associated with fitness-relevant triggers, stressful life events such as the loss of a spouse, loss of access to resources. These often intersecting with social conflict. Humans are a highly interdependent species. We depend on our social networks for everything from resource sharing and acquisition, access to childcare, sickness care, and status acquisition. Ed and I and Michael Gaffney and others have argued that depression is a means of withholding cooperation in the context of conflict with more powerful social partners. There is a large body of evolutionary work arguing that cooperation is maintained by withholding cooperation from social partners who are imposing costs. Sometimes we have the option of switching partners, as in partner choice models, but often we do not. And we often are dependent on others who have more influence in determining outcomes or who are more powerful. And powerless people, by definition, don't have recourse to violence and other means of imposing costs. However, it is often assumed that when depression involves self-harm or suicidality, that this is unequivocally maladaptive, because what could be more maladaptive than death by suicide and the loss of investment in kin and future reproduction? But in fact, the term is somewhat misleading. Most suicidality, despite referring to a manner of death, actually does not end in death most of the time. Suicidal thoughts and suicide attempts increase during adolescence, and rates sharply decline during early adulthood. 20% of US high school students, for instance, report suicidal ideation. And those rates are actually even higher in a study looking at high school students in Jamaica and Uganda. It was about 25%, and higher rates for suicide attempt as well. According to CDC data, among women aged 20, there are over 500 attempts for every one completion. And for men the same age, it's about 200 attempts to one completion. And again, this is not unique to the West. In a systematic review of the ethnographic record, Ed and I and Zach Garfield found that when individuals survived suicide attempts, they often saw improved outcomes. For instance, stopping an unwanted marriage. Suicidality as a means to influence outcomes is even reported among foragers. Marjorie Shostak, for instance, described how Kung women can use suicide threats to mobilize support to escape an unhappy marriage. And based on the ethnographic literature, we have proposed that suicidality is part of a continuum of withholding cooperation on others that includes both low-cost strategies such as avoidance, running away, and then high-cost strategies like suicidality when threats are especially severe. If the ethnographic literature, the anthropological literature on suicidality from the Pacific to South America to Asia to Africa, if it's unequivocal on one point, it's that suicidality can serve as a social signal of protest, appeal, or revenge, and even in a subset of cases, a signal of apology. In short, conflict. In this literature, suicidality is often described as part of a spectrum of behaviors that can include running away. And in fact, many times running away blurs the line with suicidality, because running into the bush, if you're a forager by yourself, is high cost and can be interpreted as a type of suicide attempt. Thus, the implication of this literature extends beyond suicide. And there's also a lot of overlap. We see examples of bargaining from what's called bargaining from weakness, including spirit possession and fasting. So I believe that this perspective has a lot of value to both evolutionary theorists and to mental health researchers. I also just want to shout out to Michael Gaffney's paper that he led that just came out in EHB, which I didn't have time to talk about, but we test this with MTurk. So check it out.
Thank you, Kristen. Okay, Matt. Simon and Bernie have sketched their theories of autism and psychosis. How well are these supported by the genetic architecture of mental disorders? Is there evidence for negative, positive, or balancing selection on risk alleles? What do we know about involvement of autism and schizophrenia risk alleles in neural versus other pathways? Can risk alleles be related to strong positive selection on cognition, human lineage, and others, and self-realization? Are these some byproducts of the massive expansion of the human brain? And how should we think about the new genetic evidence on mental disorders in light of the broader picture of human evolution?
All right, thanks, Ed. That question again, I think I could take a book to try to go through all those. I think, it's hard to know where to start. I mean, I think I need to understand Bernard's and Syme's theories better before I critique them. Let me walk through what I think is going on, but I'll try to critique them at the end with the caveat that I may not be understanding exactly what it is that they are proposing. Um, so, okay, so where to start? I mean, so first of all, I think that probably, well, okay, I'm trying to organize my thoughts. I think that probably mutation selection, which is negative or purifying selection, however you want to put it, is probably serves as a pretty good null model for most of the variation that we see in traits related to fitness, including psychiatric disorders. And I know that Syme just in the chat had said that he doesn't consider autism a disorder. I think you can call it what you will. It's a kind of matter of vocabulary, but it is associated with lower fitness, and therefore I think the heritability associated with autism would have to have some kind of evolutionary explanation. So how, just in brief, some thoughts about this mutation selection, then I'll move on to kind of how I think this might interface with Bernard and Syme's theories. So, I'd said before that there's this kind of cap on the amount of variance explained by the biggest effect allele. So I'm trying to look at the time and make sure I don't run too far over here. I think that makes some sense, right? So the effect of a particular variant on a disorder is 2pq times alpha squared. So 2pq is the MAF, the minor allele frequency, times 1 minus the minor allele frequency. That's the binomial part of the equation. Alpha squared is the effect size, the effect size squared, and that's the amount of variance accounted for a particular SNP or a variant. So if you've got really strong selection on a particular variant because it has a really big effect on the psychiatric disorder, that's going to reduce the variant. That's going to be a very rare variant. Therefore, 2pq will be large, but alpha squared 2pq will be small, but alpha squared will be large, right? So they're going to balance out to some number, say 1/20th of 1% of the variation, for example, for schizophrenia. Or on the other hand, if you have a variant that's very close to neutral, it has a very, very small effect on increasing your schizophrenia risk, like what we're seeing with GWAS data. Those types of variants can drift to appreciable frequencies. So the 2pq there will be large, but the alpha squared will be tiny. And so once again, you're kind of left with this very small effect. And on balance, across the spectrum, what we're seeing is that the alleles of influencing schizophrenia and autism have very, very small effects individually on the heritability of disorders. And I think that itself is consistent with the mutation selection balance. And furthermore, there's a lot of talk about antagonistic pleiotropy as being a cause of maintaining variance. I think that that's absolutely possible in the sense that it makes a variance closer to neutral. Whether it's a mechanism maintaining variation, I think is much more dubious for kind of theoretical reasons, but also the fact that we're not seeing negative genetic correlations across disorders. Instead, what we see is positive correlations across almost every psychiatric disorder that you can imagine, including autism and schizophrenia, which have a positive genetic correlation, which I think is a little bit difficult for Bernard's theory to explain, but I'll let him talk about that. Where else do I want to? So last things about mutation selection. One of the big things that we see is that the rarer the allele, the lower the MAF for a locus influencing disorder, the more likely it is that the minor allele is the risk allele. That's very hard to explain if what we're talking about is neutral evolution or balancing selection. So I think there's a lot of evidence consistent with kind of a mutation selection not being the explanation, but I think should be a default way to go. And we can move on to sexier or more interesting hypotheses, I think, to the degree that it's having a hard time explaining the pattern of the data. But to this point, I think it's a pretty good default explanation for what we see. So now moving on to Syme and Bernard's explanations. I'm about 5 minutes, so I don't have long. So just let me say this. So there's explanations that schizophrenia or other traits are byproducts of what it means to be human, or of language evolution, and I think that is totally possible in the sense that it may help us understand the pan-human propensity to develop these disorders. right? Or may help us explain why, when mutations have this particular influence, it looks like it does in humans. And it doesn't look like that in other species. We don't see the same types of disorders, for example, in chimpanzees, or not that I'm aware of, although perhaps we do. So I think it can help us explain the way that disorders look, or a general human risk that we have to disorders. What it doesn't explain, in my mind, is the genetic variation underlying disorders. Why some people have a disorder that increases risk and other people have a disorder that decreases risk. And it's that variation, at least, that the understanding the heritability of the disorders, that I think is evolutionarily the paradox. So where to go? I think that is where I'll stop, and I'm about 6 minutes, so I'll stop there.
Thank you. Simon, you argue that empathizing versus systematizing are two adaptive circuits that evolved 100,000 years ago, and that there are typical sex differences. Females are more empathizing and males more systematizing. What's your evolutionary scenario for this sex difference? How do your views on empathizing versus systematizing, i.e. the extreme male brain, align or contrast with autism and psychosis as diametric disorders?
Okay, thanks, Ed. So I think I'm going to answer this, first of all, by telling you about a study we published in 2018. It was published in PNAS, where we invited a large population, 600,000 people, to complete 3 online questionnaires. One was measuring autistic traits, that's the AQ, or the Autism Spectrum Quotient. A second was measuring empathy, that's the EQ, or the Empathy Quotient. And then the last one was called the Systemizing Quotient, the SQ, which measures how interested you are in understanding systems in the world. I'll just tell you a few about some of these results, because I think it's relevant to your question. So first thing is, we found this interesting association between autistic traits and people working in STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math, that people working in STEM had, on average, had more autistic traits than people not working in STEM. On the face of it, these two phenotypes shouldn't have anything to do with each other, and yet they show a link. And it kind of confirmed a finding from an earlier study showing that autism rates are higher in places like Silicon Valley, where people who are good at STEM, good at understanding systems, gravitate and start families. We actually did that study not in Silicon Valley, California, but a Silicon Valley in Europe, in the Dutch city Eindhoven, which is, which has a third of its jobs are in IT. Finding autism rates were twice as high there than in other Dutch cities. So we're seeing this link between autism and aptitude in understanding patterns or systems. But back to that big study, what we also found was sex differences in empathy and systemizing. So we could take the difference between your EQ and your SQ to derive 5 different brain types in the population. We think of this as an illustration of neurodiversity. Some people lean more towards empathy than systemizing, so we call them type E, and more women in the population show that profile. Some people lean more towards systemizing than empathy. We call that type S, and more men in the population show that profile. There's also a profile called type B for balanced, where people don't show much of a difference between their empathy and their systemizing levels. And then there are the extremes, extreme type E, or people who empathize non-stop but struggle with systemizing, or extreme type S, people who are recognizing patterns all the time but struggle with empathy. And what we found in this big online study, we had 36,000 autistic people took part. So big data was that most autistic people have a brain of type S or extreme type S. So again, showing a link between autism and a brain that is wired to spot patterns and understand how things work even if they struggle with understanding people. The sex differences are interesting. We did conclude at the end of that paper that autism is showing a profile that's an extreme of the typical male profile. So in that sense, we can use that language of the extreme male brain theory of autism. What's giving rise to it could be partly cultural and social factors, but I think that we should also be looking for partly genetic and prenatal hormonal factors, just because we've also found in other work that autism is associated with elevated prenatal sex steroids like androgens and estrogens that, in quotes, masculinize the brain. So we need to look at prenatal biology to understand why autism seems to represent a shift along this dimension of brain types towards pattern recognition and away from understanding other people's thoughts and feelings. Finally, you asked me to comment on how my work relates to Bernie's. We haven't studied psychosis or schizophrenia. I am interested by Bernie's, fascinating proposal that autism and schizophrenia or psychosis might be mirror opposites of each other. But I just can't, I think I'd need to sort of see how where they are located on some of the dimensions I've been describing.
All right, thank you. Final question in this round to Bernie. You recently proposed that autism could be understood as increases in numerous dimensions of pattern cognition, and for example, recognition and pattern narration, and with attenuated sociality as a byproduct. You relate your pattern cognition approach to autism to Syme's systemizing dimension. You'd argue that the pattern idea can explain several symptoms that the systematizing approach cannot. Could you elaborate a bit on that? And how do your views on autism and psychosis relate to the evolution of human cognition in general?
Right. I have to apologize to Simon. I had not read his book on systemizing before I produced my little paper on pattern. And all that I did in my little paper, I think, was push Simon's ideas a little bit towards what is sometimes called the low functioning end of the autism spectrum, and apply the concept of pattern to traits such as stereotypies and insistence on sameness and self-stimulation and lining up objects, and considering those in terms of pattern in a more general way than one might with systemizing itself. So I think this is an extension of Simon's theory there. Now, I did want to get back to the points that Matt raised, because I think that they bring forth something very interesting. The physicist Niels Bohr said, "We have met with a paradox. Now there is hope for real progress." And I think we've met with a paradox here, in that the ideas that me and Simon have been describing involve extremes of adaptations. So too much systemizing, for example, or too much systemizing and too little empathizing, so we can have extremes of trade-offs as well. But the idea that mental disorders involve extremes of adaptations, I think, is quite a general one. So OCD involving extremes of conscientiousness would be another example. And extremes of adaptations seem almost like the opposite of mutation selection balance models, because under mutation selection balance, what you have is a suite of bad alleles, and if you add those up, well, you just get something that should be bad and should not have positive dimensions. And the positive dimensions that you see are quite clear in autism, related to systemizing, related to intelligence self. And in schizophrenia, the positive dimensions are related to art and literature, and these have been very, very well documented. So it is paradoxical then when the genetic data faces up to the psychological data, there is a major disconnect. And, I don't know where to go to try to solve that. I don't think the answers are in necessarily visible now in the genetics. We can get bigger and bigger samples and get more and more genes with smaller and smaller effect sizes. Genetic risk scores are very useful and can be very informative, but in terms of getting us at the actual causes of autism or schizophrenia, I don't see it happening. It's just all we're going to get is a bunch of gene ontology output, and the system is just too complex at the genetic level to be able to sort it out. What we need is for the genetic side and the psychological side to somehow come together in some way to try to resolve what I see as a paradox there. Thank you.
Thanks, Bernie. Did you want to quickly respond to that?
I'm sorry?
I was asking if Matt wanted to quickly respond to that.
Yeah, so Ed, we're having a little well, you're cutting out a bit, so it's sometimes hard to understand, but yeah, briefly. So Bernard, I do take exception. So I disagree with what you said that, let me see what you said. So extremes of adaptation seem the opposite of mutation selection balance, and I disagree with that. I mean, I think what you typically see is natural selection will move a trait to its optimal level, but then what you need to understand is why is there variation still around that optimal level? And if it's a single gene, I mean, everybody's basically going to be at that optimal level, but if there's a lot of genes influencing a trait, you're going to have a big mutational target size, you're going to see a lot of variation up and down, right? So for height, for example, there are mutations that cause people to be really tall. Those are selected against by, well, those decrease fitness, as do mutations that decrease. So it works in both directions, even if you might say on average that taller is more attractive and therefore higher fitness. Same thing I would think with schizophrenia, if you're thinking that it's related to, or autism for that matter, but for schizophrenia is related to more creativity or more artistic thinking, and that's an adaptation that's kind of spread throughout the population. I completely agree, but I think that there's some optimal level of that, and there are mutations probably that cause, on average, minds to be a little lower on that dimension, and mutations that cause them to be a little bit higher. My guess is that both of those types of mutations, are being selected against. And what we're seeing for schizophrenia are the ones that are pushing you to the high end. What are pushing you to the low end, that's an open question. I think the other issue, another example of this would be for the genetics underlying depression. I think it's perfectly consistent to say that depression is both itself is underlied by adaptations that are in response to negative situations in the environment, and that the genetic variation underlying depression is itself maladaptive in nature, and that those are not inconsistent in my view.
Thanks, Matt. I'll jump in really quickly. What a lot of people don't realize is that things like divorce are heritable. So some of the environmental risk factors for depression, like adversity, are actually heritable. So the genetic pathways to depression in particular are very complex and in some cases counterintuitive. I do now want to take our last few minutes to entertain some questions from the audience here. So our top voted question here, mutation selection theory versus balancing selection theory sounds pretty abstract, but many trees are poised to start using polygenic scores for embryo selection. They might start aggressively selecting out genetic variants associated with mental disorders. Does that give some extra urgency getting our theory right? And that's from Jeffrey Miller and Diana Fleischman. Let's go to Simon first on that, and then Matt.
I've put a reply into the chat because I think Jeff Miller, thank you for that question, and it's very relevant because part of what we're trying to do in autism research and autism clinical services is to send a message to the autism community that they are very welcome, that for a long time autistic people have been excluded from society. We have to remind ourselves that the majority of autistic adults are unemployed, and the majority of autistic adults have poor mental health, including high suicide rates, kind of relevant to Kristen's interest and topic. But a lot of that may reflect that autistic people have been left unsupported and stigmatized. And the idea that geneticists might start developing prenatal tests to screen out embryos using polygenic scores for embryos that might have a high likelihood of later autism. My worry there is that it would send a very negative message about how autistic people are not wanted in our population, in our gene pool, and it would take us back to the bad old days of eugenics.
Yeah,
Thank
so
you. Matt, go ahead.
Yeah, it's a great question from Jeffrey. Thanks, Jeffrey. So I agree with Simon. I mean, yeah, it's important to get it right, because I think on balance, balancing selection would suggest that by screening for these things, you're going to really have negative consequences that were unintended. But I think that same unintended negative consequences still occur if you believe that mutation selection balance is responsible, because I would imagine that there's pretty widespread, especially for common variants, common SNPs underlying disorders, there's probably pretty widespread antagonistic pleiotropy that occurs that makes the effect of the variant that we're seeing less negative to fitness than we would have expected based on its effect on the trait. And those types of variants, even if they're rare per mutation, are going to be much more common among those that we see segregating in the population, just because their effects on fitness are much closer to neutral. So I do think that there's real concern for using polygenic scores to screen embryos. This is happening right now, by the way, right? This isn't some weird future dystopian. This is occurring now. There are companies doing this today. And I think that I have real concerns about where that's going to take us. And I really think we've got to get a better handle on the degree to which there's antagonistic pleiotropy. And even if there's not, I think there's other ethical questions that this raises that we would need to tackle, I think, before we should be doing this as a society. But, in some ways, the cat's out of the bag, and this is already happening. So I think it's important that geneticists and other, thinkers tackle this issue head on. And so anyway, I'll stop there.
Thanks, Matt. I think we have time for about one more question here. So let me take the next top voted question. If we decenter our understanding of mental health and illness away from weird cultures, Western educated, industrialized, democratic, how does this impact our understanding and treatment or not of experience of anxiety or depression, autism, schizophrenia, etc.? Are certain sociological factors such as population density, genetic relatedness, pathogens, marriage systems, and broad level moderators and an evolutionary understanding of mental health and illness? That's from David Schmidt. Anybody want to take that one?
It's a big question.
Kristen?
I missed the first
We've done a lot of
part.
work with non-weird cultures.
Right. Was that I missed the first part. Was that a what if question or what do we know question? What?
It's off my thing here. But if we decenter our understanding, I think they're trying to get a lot of different non-weird cultures have different environmental factors that might be more prevalent, less prevalent than what we see in the United States and Europe. And so how might that actually influence our understanding if these broad level environmental factors that differ might actually have a big impact on the patterns that we're seeing?
Yeah. So we know, for instance, that based on the work that Carl Worthman and Brendan Court have done, that there is an increase in depression and anxiety and PTSD in conflict-prone regions. So the environment, aspects of the environment and the culture and the society definitely do impact, especially these common disorders that appear to be triggered by the environment. Also, suicidality, suicide deaths vary dramatically. In Muslim, so we in our culture we associate suicide death with males who are usually older, But in Muslim majority countries, especially in rural areas, we see women more likely to die by suicide than men. In many Pacific Islander communities and other colonized communities, we see that young people, not old people, are much more likely to die by suicide. Suicide is we probably have the best data on because it's unambiguous. We know exactly what someone died, and so we're not unclear about the validity of a scale. So there is a little bit less work on depression and anxiety, but that work is growing. For instance, there's recent work looking at food insecurity around the world that both absolute and relative food insecurity is associated with depression and mental distress. And there's recent work that household water insecurity is also associated with depression. So yes, absolutely, aspects of the environment, aspects to resources. It appears very much that it impacts mental health. And I think it's a fascinating question about, like social systems, is it a matrilineal, patrilineal, matrilocal society? Those are big questions that, I don't think we have the answers to, but it's really fascinating.
Thank you, Kristen. We are at time here. I think I will ask Courtney to give some guidance. I do have some extra time to hang around, but I'm not sure if that is something we can do. So I'll let Courtney kind of guide us from here.
Yeah, if you want to, keep talking or answering some questions, that's more than welcome. But I just want to say that before we do go, thanks to all of you for this wonderful discussion. And again, the Executive Council for their support. And I know that we did have some mic feedback, so hopefully posting the questions in the chat was helpful. But please feel free to send us any feedback that you may have at hbesroundtableseries@gmail.com. And yeah, do you want to keep answering that question, or we can end it?
So Bernie at Simon, do you want it here, or do you have a few more minutes? There are a few interesting questions in the chat here from our audience. Yeah, so let's go with that. Courtney, I wonder if you might read them. I'm giving a bad echo. It might be a little more effective for you to do it than me.
Yes. Okay, great idea. So we have multiple questions that are at the top, but I will just start with the first one. So some research has discovered a shared polygenic P factor among psychiatric disorders. How does that complicate our understanding of those disorders? Anyone, feel free.
Well, I could just speak briefly to that. I mean, presumably there are genes that would simply make people who have them, alleles that make people more vulnerable to any sort, a whole variety of different sorts of perturbations, probably especially during neurodevelopment. So there could be genes that, say, reduce the ability of the developmental system to canalize development of the brain, and that could be a mechanism for the production of such a P factor. And it would be very interesting to figure out what that was, because if you knew the genetic mechanisms of that, then you could, in principle, find ways of reducing a whole range of negative effects in one fell swoop.
Yeah, I agree, and I think it's interesting, this P factor research, and I'd say that it's it's consistent with what I'd said a second ago about that there's this kind of overall positive genetic correlation across psychiatric disorders that you see when you use methods like LD score regression, which are not just looking at the genome-wide significant variants, but all the variants across the genome that are associated, even those that aren't significant. And so I mean, all of those disorders have correlations ranging from like positive 0.1 to like positive 0.7, and the strongest is schizophrenia and bipolar. I think this suggests that we are not doing a good job of cutting nature at its joints when it comes to the definitions of these psychiatric disorders. This is a point that I guess Kristen raised at the very beginning. I think it's that well, I don't know, I start repeating myself, but I do think that what that is showing us is that we've got to do a better job of understanding the underlying endophenotypes that then may have simpler kind of causal etiologies, and allow us to better define what these psychiatric disorders actually are, or how we should define them.
Great. And maybe we can have one more question. Is that all right with all of you? Okay, so I'm going to pick this one. How is the concept of trait or spectrum of mental illness compatible with clinical decisions to treat or not to treat? Wouldn't there still be a need to define a threshold above which a trait is intense enough to afford a clinical diagnosis? And how different would this be from the current category-based diagnostic approach? Maybe Kristen, maybe you have a response to this.
Oh gosh, I mean that gets into clinical aspect. I don't know if I'm so comfortable talking about that, because I don't want to say that, I don't want to claim that I have the best ideas in terms of treatment. So maybe not really my domain.
Go for it.
Well, I mean, this gets to an idea that, Kristen, you discussed it in that recent paper of yours about so-called harmful dysfunction, and how the word harmful dysfunction in the context of a mental disorder is a societal issue, and that involves the individual and their family and their community, and it's a purely ethical question about whether some aspect of a mental disorder is harmful or not. It's not a scientific question. So I think one needs to sort of very carefully separate the ethical issues from the scientific issues, between the is and the ought, in cases like this. And the ethical issues are very difficult, but they need to be faced up to.
Okay, why don't we end it there? Thank you all to our panelists. I apologize for my echo. I forgot to bring my headphones in, so for your patience as well. Thank you, Simon. Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Kristen. Thank you, Bernie. Thank you, Courtney. It's really been, thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks. And we will announce the next event soon. We are still planning it, so thanks all.